It's good to be back after what is it? After a week off. Um, just waiting for folks to trickle in here. I have apparently the wrong caption up on TikTok, but that's okay. People will figure it out eventually. Anyway, it's great to be back. I'm excited to talk about this topic in particular. It's one of our more straightforward topics, but I'm not sure that there are many people here yet, so I'm going to wait a moment and see as people trickle in. We can gear up and start talking about the practice of gerrymandering and gerrymandering as a form of election rigging. Um, and in fact, I would say we would consider that the form of election rigging that is predominant in this country. It is well known. It is front and center. It is obvious, and yet we have not solved it. There is a lot of talk about election rigging these days, but the talk is mostly distracted from this very real practice that has been going on in plain sight for centuries, which is essentially representatives, elected officials, using their power to determine who their voters are. This is a vicious cycle. Of course, they're going to get reelected over and over and over again, because how could they not? They're choosing their voters rather than the voters choosing them. And this practice of gerrymandering, again, is centuries old. And that's because we give the power to draw districts to elected officials. You have state legislators drawing districts that favor their friends who are running for office for specific districts, which leads to party loyalty and parties basically taking over entire states unjustly and disproportionately to the number of people that live there in those communities and that are supposed to be represented, which is why you end up with these very odd shaped districts. For those of you on TikTok, you can see what an example of that in the top right of the screen. But this is actually why it's called gerrymandering. It's a bit of a play on words of these districts that kind of look like a salamander. And it's really unfortunate because really what they're doing is they are ripping communities apart, both literally and figuratively, in order to perpetuate their reign in power and in order to try to win a chess match against the other party. And they are using the people and the communities in their state as pawns. And this should be so unacceptable. And it's gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court tends to sort of be overlooking it, unfortunately. For better or for worse, the Supreme Court, in trying to determine whether there are constitutional grounds to overturn gerrymandered districts, has not found apparently enough justification to do so firmly, which is why we are proposing a constitutional amendment that does so, or provides them with the very clear grounds by which they can say that a district has been gerrymandered, that people have been disenfranchised, and that communities are not being reflected because they are being used as pawns in a partisan chess match. And so we have a very clear solution for this. In fact, it's been proposed and it's generally agreed upon both in the academic community, in the political community, in across the aisle, that there are very clear ways to measure whether a district has been gerrymandered. And essentially, the very first criteria is looking at the shape. How absurd does it look? And what they call a well-shaped district is called being compact and contiguous. And what that means is it's not spread out all over the place. It's not sprawling in all sorts of directions, and that it doesn't have gaps in it, that it actually is connected, that it's not broken up into multiple pieces just to chop people into various groups. so that they can exclude groups of people from their voting bloc because they believe that that group of people could actually outvote them and throw them out of office. Totally unacceptable practice. It is anti-democratic, anti-republic if you don't believe that America is a democracy. I mean, being a republic means that we believe in having representatives that represent us, and this is completely counter to that. This means that the people are representing the representative in a way that the representative is choosing, not in the way that people are choosing. And so we are working to transcend this practice, overturn this practice, overcome this practice by proposing, as part of our second constitutional amendment that we're proposing in the Reconstitution, our proposed 29th Amendment to the Reconstitution. One important but small clause in this is to resolve the issue of gerrymandering. And we do this, as I said, in two ways. One is by mandating that districts are what's called compact and contiguous. What I mean by that is that it is just a reasonable shape. It does not look like a salamander or a sprawling wasteland that doesn't represent any communities. And contiguous means that it's continuous, for lack of a better word, that it's connected. It's not just sort of a scatter of blobs throughout a region. Just to clarify for TikTok folk, Wenswood, thank you for the question. I have the wrong caption up. That was last week. We were talking about a third chamber of Congress. This week we're talking about election rigging, specifically gerrymandering. So the first piece is saying that we have compact and contiguous districts. The second piece is really important, and it's a relatively complicated concept to explain. But once you wrap your head around it, it makes a lot of sense. And what it's what's called minimizing the efficiency gap. No problem, Wenswood. It's my fault for not updating the caption. I'll do a better job of that next time. But please continue to join us. This is a really fascinating topic. And everyone, feel free to ask questions in the chat. I will do my best to respond as they come in. But trying to keep everyone engaged at the same time. So the second piece is to minimize the efficiency gap. What do I mean by that? So the efficiency gap measures the number of votes that have been wasted. And what I mean by that is that if you vote for a losing candidate, that means that your vote has essentially been wasted because it didn't go towards the candidate that won. Now, bear with me for a second. What it also means is if you voted for a candidate who won and you provided just a superfluous extra vote that they didn't need, your vote was also, in a way, wasted. And so we can calculate the number of votes that were wasted by the votes that went to the losing candidate and the votes that went to the winning candidate. And we can try to minimize that number. Now, I know it's hard to wrap your head around, but when we use computers to model what that looks like, what you actually end up with are distinct communities, the communities that really are trying to be represented in a representative democracy, in a constitutional republic. And so by using math and feeding that math into a computer as a sort of as a model for it to use, as a rule base for it to use, what you end up with is community-based districts. And so as a result, you have representatives that are less partisan and better represent the interests of the community because they haven't been sort of used as pawn pieces to get extreme candidates in or partisan candidates in. Now, I will have to re-explain that in different words over and over again, and I apologize, and I will do that to the best of my ability. I also apologize. I have a little bit of brain fog. I'm recovering from COVID right now, doing my best, but will continue to also field questions. Mr. Barricade has a great question that I'm not sure I fully understand, but would love to. Will we have enclaves and exclaves? I would love to get a better understanding of what you mean by that. I understand the word enclaves, um, exclaves. Um, I would love to better understand what that means in this context. Um, yeah, I understand what it means in a geographical term, but I'm not sure I understand what it means in a gerrymandering term. Um, will we have islands separated from a precinct? Um, no. I think, and gerrymandering isn't necessarily a shape. Gerrymandering is the creation of specific shapes that favor a group by breaking people into different um, constituencies that help sort of move chess pieces around to ensure that they can have a majority in a specific area, or they can water down the voices of a specific group of people. It's done actually very intensely to drown out minority voices, where they will split, for example, a Black community or an urban community or a specific identity group into multiple pieces, so that they don't actually have any representative, because they are broken up into enough pieces that they actually never have enough of a voice to get a representative of their own. If you have a follow up on that, Mr. Barricade, I'm happy to. Oh, will it still create pieces? So that's a great question. If you use a computer model and your only criteria is efficiency gap minimization, you could end up with pieces and enclaves and exclaves. That's why the other piece that I mentioned first, having compact and contiguous territories as the other rule set that computers use to generate these districts, is important to ensure that we don't end up with these sort of weird islands or these weird shapes. So it has to meet both criteria. It has to both be compact and contiguous, and it has to minimize the efficiency gap. That's a great question. And by doing both of those things, you actually end up with something that looks very clean and actually represents communities. Like I said, you end up with people who know each other or who have the same interests end up being grouped together, and therefore they can find a representative that best represents them as a community, which is really the purpose of a representative democracy. Daniel has said that be careful what you wish for. I'm curious to better understand what your concern is there. If it is around computers sort of doing this, I have some ideas around how you can create checks and balances and accountability. And of course, it's not like we're setting this off in an AI to run forever without any checks and balances, but I want to better understand your concern there. Mr. Barricade, will it be purely people-based, or will it also account for money or land? Interesting question. So it will account for land in the fact that it needs to be compact and contiguous, as I mentioned, but it will be purely people-based in the sense that it's actually purely vote-based. So it's based on, again, the efficiency gap and wasted votes. So money is not a factor in this. Land is not a factor in this, which is important because, of course, population density in cities, for example, will cover a much smaller amount of land for a district than a district might be quite large in a more sprawling and expansive rural or suburban area. So I am curious and open to feedback on that. If you think there's an issue with that I'm not seeing, or a concern with that may arise from using that approach, but generally in the policy and academic and political communities, there's some pretty widespread agreement that the combination of compact, contiguous, and minimizing the efficiency gap or minimizing wasted votes is the most fair and democratic way to form representative districts. The Real Swifted has asked me what my party is. I'm an independent. I don't have a party. I would love to see, and we will discuss this in a couple of weeks, ways to get more independent candidates and third-party candidates elected. I think there are, we will discuss ranked choice voting and things like that. There are significant barriers to having nonpartisan candidates in office, and that is intentional, and we are going to work to tackle that as well. Gerrymandering could help a little bit with that. It won't directly. But to answer your question, I do not have a party. I do not want to have a party. And I believe that we need to start breaking up the idea of being attached to parties as teams or tribes in order to solve problems in this country and in order to be able to have conversations about issues. Because if we all are only attached to our team and rooting for a team, we can't really engage with individual topics. Mr. Barricade, then there will be huge swaths of land decided on by one electorate. When looking at climate resources flooding, this better than what we have, though. I would love to hear if you have some other suggestions. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by huge swaths decided on by one electorate. Huge swaths of, oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, you may have huge swaths of land by one electorate. It's actually a great concern because you could have a large piece of the environment that should be protected that only has one representative potentially protecting it or looking after its interest. I do think that it's a great point about climate resources flooding. It's something I would have to think about. But I would say, I think this is important. Firstly, in tandem with our other proposals, which get money out of politics and things like that, you would have better politicians who would also care about those issues because those issues do impact people in districts that are neighboring, etc. And what we discussed last week, 2 weeks ago, our third Chamber of Congress proposal, which actually does provide individual representatives to represent urban areas, suburban areas, rural areas, and that helps counterbalance with the counter-majoritarian principle, providing the minority voices of those more expansive, less populated lands with a larger voice. I see. I am an urban planner and transportation engineer. I think about precincts a lot. That makes sense. I understand where you're coming from. I'm not sure if you followed what I just said about our third Chamber of Congress proposal. Super interesting. We got a lot of love on that a couple of weeks ago and a lot of interest in it. It's something that's totally unique to our group, the Reconstitution, our movement, something I'm really excited about. You can learn more about it watching some videos. We do have an explainer video out there. We had, again, if you go to our YouTube, you can watch the entire talk that we had on it a couple of weeks ago. But the long story short is that we would create a body, a new Chamber of Congress, a small one, that equally weighs urban, suburban, and rural areas in its representation. And so ultimately, that is the body that would probably best satisfy your concern about this counter-majoritarian, sort of the tyranny of the majority, drowning out people who live in more expansive areas that need representation. Gerrymandering ain't bad if the people are involved and participate, right? I think by definition, gerrymandering does not involve the people. So I'm wondering if you're thinking of it in a different way. I'm very curious to hear a little bit more about that. I think by definition, gerrymandering is something that elected officials do independently of the people to divide up the people in ways that favor their interests. I think if you're talking about more about the shape, of course, I don't think the shape matters as much. That's why compact and contiguous is kind of a broad principle that can be sort of bent in ways to better meet the criteria of minimizing the efficiency gap. But let's see, don't we all participate with the precinct process? I went to meetings and fought a lot, but most people don't participate. That's a really interesting. I actually would love to talk to you more specifically about that, Mr. Barricade. And if you would like to get more involved in our group, I'd be happy to talk to you and send a DM. Please do DM this account afterwards, or you know, after this talk, and I'd be happy to engage more with you. I'm not familiar with the precinct process, and I'm not sure whether that overlaps with the electoral districting process. If there the same, if they're different, if they overlap, I'm always open to learning. I'm not an expert on everything. So I would say that my that goes a little bit past my level of expertise here. But I would love to learn more about it, because if that's the case, it's something to definitely worth examining. Um, we don't decide, but they have many meetings. Got it. So that, and I think that is the problem. People can participate. People don't participate for a couple of reasons, right? One is people don't have the time to participate in every aspect of the process. This is why we have representation in this country, because, well, one of the reasons, which is that we entrust very important decisions to the people who are supposed to represent us. Unfortunately, that has been corrupted by this process, this sort of vicious cycle where those people want to stay in office. And so they use their power to decide how the next person gets in power, which tends to favor them. I think the other reason people don't participate is that people are just disenchanted. People don't feel like it'll make a difference because, and I do think that that's probably true. If someone wants to stay in power, even if people come to a meeting and propose that a district be drawn a different way, they will probably still go behind closed doors and ensure that they stay in power. I would love to look into the way San Francisco Bay Area was decided. I would imagine it's a probably easier scenario to navigate. I don't know, mostly because the interests and the partisanship there is relatively homogenous, as far as it's pretty progressive, pretty liberal. There aren't really enclaves of conservative areas there, so it may have been an easier case to manage. But I would love to learn more about that if you can send me some links on the way San Francisco Bay Area did that. Very interesting, Mr. Barricade. If you could DM us a link about that. Yes, but exactly. There's not many conservatives anyway, so it's probably easier to manage. Brian Russ, MAGA is a cult. We are not talking about election rigging in the MAGA sense here. We are talking about gerrymandering. It's actually intentionally, we're reframing election rigging to what we consider the real election rigging. And I do have to agree that the cult-like mentality of MAGA and people that are have been relatively brainwashed by the big lie that the last election was rigged without any substantive evidence is a problem. And so we're trying to reframe election rigging because, or at least the term election rigging, because there is election rigging going on. It's just not the election rigging they think there is. Of course, and we're glad to have you here, Brian. Thank you so much for joining. Someone on Facebook, I don't have your name here, but says gerrymandering by definition is abuse of power. Yes, absolutely. And that's why we're tackling it head on. It's an easy one as far as conceptually for people to get behind, to agree on. Of course, we don't want abuse of power. We don't want people in power to be deciding how people get into power. But it is a natural byproduct of a system that hasn't yet prohibited it explicitly in the Constitution. Hi, Sharon Morris. It's good to see you again. So thank you for that comment. And that's why it's difficult and needs to be constitutionalized, because it is so important and fundamental, and yet so inevitable if it's not explicitly stated at this top level of supreme law. Let's see. Jim Jordan's district is the reason he's in Congress. I would probably agree with that. I don't know exactly the history of Jim Jordan's election district drawing process, but if it's like most other districts in this country, it probably had some gerrymandering involved, and Jim Jordan probably had a lot of say in it. And will you end up with districts? Let me just say, will you end up with districts where you have extreme candidates? You still will. It will happen, because you have districts that have people with extreme views, and you know what? They deserve representation too. My hope and my belief is that those representatives, those districts, would likely be drowned out by the more I don't want to say moderate, but the more tempered, the more open-minded, the more civil districts that exist and people that exist in this country. I would love to look more into that, Brian. Feel free to send it to our DMs or do a video and share it with us, and we'd be happy to repost it as well, because we agree this practice is atrocious and people should be ashamed of themselves. But ultimately, when you put yourselves in the shoes of these people, and it's very hard to do that because what they are doing truly is an abuse of power, and none of us can really imagine doing what they're doing. But to humanize them for a moment, politics is their career, and they have families, and it's how they get their paycheck. And so not only is an abuse of power, but they have a different incentive that they don't want to lose their job. And that's a human instinct. So I think there's some compassion we can find there. That said, it doesn't excuse the practice, but it does help explain a little bit why there is this corruption of human nature that happens when people get into power. They will do whatever it takes to stay in power, especially when that power is what feeds their family at their dinner table. And there's ways to there's ways that we can check against these lesser angels, for lack of a better term, of the human spirit, that can come out when there's an opportunity for it to come out. When there's an opportunity, as Cher just mentioned, for corruption, we need to have, and this is part of the purpose of a constitutional republic, a constitution, is to create boundaries that prevent corruption, oppression, and all of these negative byproducts of human nature and greed and insecurity, that when that manifests itself in society and in government, can be corrosive and at the expense of others. And yes, it is called oppression, and it is called corruption, and it is not acceptable, but it is a natural outgrowth of human nature in a society that does not have adequate rules in place to channel our behavior in directions that are civil and democratic and cooperative. Let's see, Mr. Barricade. I think the biggest issue is private government consulting with everything. We do have a proposal talking a little bit about this, or a lot about the separation of money and politics. That does speak a little bit about the lobbying and government consulting, Mr. Barricade. So you can check that out. We also have a video on that from about a month ago, both an explainer video, and we had a conversation about that about an hour long. So you can check those out as well. I'd love to see a transition to a parliamentary system. Pickled Pagan, interesting name. We appreciate it. Could you tell us more about what you mean by to a parliamentary system? I've gotten feedback in the past that what I'm proposing is a transition to a parliamentary system. I'm not sure I see the connection to our system, or at least the distinction, or how that would help us, but I would love to further understand what you mean by that. I get the sense when people think of parliamentary systems, because we do have parliamentary systems in Congress, right? We have parliamentary rules, we have parliamentarians. I think that there's generally a conflation of parliamentary systems with other countries that have or are more front and center about being a parliament, for example, and they have more parties and coalitions. I think we can have that sort of a transition by virtue of what we're going to discuss in a couple of weeks, which is ranked choice voting, which opens up the opportunity to have independent candidates, third-party candidates, and then that opens up the possibility of having multiple parties that can form coalitions. Dude Bro 12345 January 6th thoughts. Are you asking me for my January 6th thoughts, or are you just potentially assuming by virtue of the title of this that that's what I'm talking about? It is not. I am talking about gerrymandering. My thoughts on January 6th, we can save that for another day, but I do think that it is a day that is a turning point in this country, and is it really needs to be um, carefully dealt with in order to manage the fact that it was a attempted coup that was facilitated and unfortunately fueled by an outgoing president losing power. We need to make sure it doesn't happen again, but we also need to make sure that we don't tear the country apart in doing so. So it's a very delicate balance. Should it fail to do so, we should construct a new government. Um, I'm not sure I understand what it is in your sentence there, Spongy Waffles. But we are talking about a reconstitution, which would involve significant reform and revision to our existing constitution. Parliament by design seems to be more conducive to the multiple political parties. Yeah, I think I that's what I thought you were getting at. I think that it's not necessarily conducive to multiple political parties. I think we have a barrier in this country to multiple political parties. I think Congress itself is essentially the equivalent of a parliament. The difference being in countries that call it a parliament tend to be separate from some sort of a more a figurehead, such as a king or a queen or a prince or a princess, who sort of the monarchy, which is more of a figurehead, in the parliament, which is more of the government, with a prime minister. Perhaps what you're getting at is the idea that the Congress itself would elect the president. I'm not sure that that's the direction that we would approach here. I'm not sure that it solves any issues. But I do think I agree. I know I agree that political parties, or at least the centralization of our political parties, the stranglehold that our two-party system has on this country, is a big problem. And we want to address that in the proposal we'll be discussing in a couple of weeks. Dude Bro says, it just seems like any significant third party would never take power, instead just be a spoiler. Yes, I'm very excited. So you should definitely join us in a couple of weeks. Ranked choice voting is the way to end that issue. Easy. And that's why the Forward Party, Andrew Yang's party, it is their front and center proposal. The problem is getting the momentum to do it on a national or on a federal level. There actually is a lot of momentum on state by state or local by local jurisdictions. Maine is currently using ranked choice voting, which is why you see independent senators in Maine. New York City just introduced ranked choice voting, which will probably result in independent or third party candidates winning there. Basically what it means, and I'll just get ahead of myself as a preview, is that if you vote for a third party candidate and they don't have a chance of winning, they don't spoil anything. Your vote just gets redistributed to one of your second or third choices who have more of a chance. And we'll talk a lot about that in a little bit more detail in a couple of weeks. You can check out, look up ranked choice voting online. There's some really great videos on it, but we are definitely going to be a big discussion on that. And I'm glad you're interested. It is one, in my opinion, perhaps of all of the proposals I have in the Reconstitution, maybe the most important. It's hard to say that when you have separation of money in politics and gerrymandering and all of these really important issues, but at a fundamental change level, it could have the largest impact. And so I'm really excited to share that with you all in a couple of weeks from now. Very interesting upgrade to democracy, to move away from what's a 2,000+ year old version of democracy where you just choose a candidate, and if your candidate doesn't win, your vote goes out the door, to a system that's a little bit more nuanced, and you can have a little bit more say in, well, if my first choice doesn't win, can my second choice? Can I have a third choice? So it's super interesting. Wait, so U.S. doesn't use ranked choice voting? No, not at a federal level. Not in most places. We are starting to get it in some places, but it should be everywhere, period. And again, we will discuss this in a couple of weeks. I'm curious to know where you're from, Illuminous One. Australia. Very interesting to know that you guys do. And do you do that within each district in Australia at the country level, the national level? Is it just everywhere, or is it in certain pockets? I'm very interested to hear more. And do you like it? Um, let's see. Let me just turn back to Facebook for a moment. We need decentralization. It's the natural evolution. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by decentralization here? Are you talking about states' rights? I'm happy to address it. I see the Reconstitution as a needed step to help us not crash and burn in the inevitable collapse, and decentralization can work in the background in the meantime and integrate it slowly. That's how I see the Reconstitution. Is I'm trying to create a conversation in advance because I don't think we're there yet, but we are coming to some dangerous times. And I think someone alluded to January 6th. That may have just been a preview of further moments of sort of inflammation and eruption in this country. And so we are trying to get conversations on consensus ready so that when the moment does come, that everything that there is a crisis large enough that we really do need to talk about massive overhaul to our systems and institutions. We have already had some level of consensus on that. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering, is this still Cher Morris? Let me know. Let's see. Federal and state elections in Australia have ranked choice voting. Not sure about the local level. Fascinating. I would love to learn more, Illuminous. How do you think it's working? Are there any downfalls? Are there unintended consequences we're not thinking about? Or is it just really fantastic and has worked out great? Also, how long has it been in practice in Australia? Very curious to learn more. I did not realize Australia was that far ahead on ranked choice voting. Let's see. If anyone else has questions, feel free to post them. But again, just to turn our focus back to the topic that we're talking about today, which is gerrymandering, which is the real election rigging that's been going on for centuries in plain sight and is an abuse of power, utter corruption, as someone said. 100% needs to be stopped. The representatives in this country should not be choosing their voters. Voters should be choosing their representatives. And so back to the solution, how do we prevent it, Devin? Thank you for asking that. I mentioned it earlier, but I know it's been a while. We have a way of doing so that is quite simple and agreed upon in political and academic communities. It's very, very simple. A little complicated to explain, but simple. One is we mandate that districts are what's called compact and contiguous, which means none of this weird shape stuff. You can see one in the top right of the screen. It needs to be a reasonable shape that makes sense, is criteria number one. Criteria two is a little bit more complicated. It's called, we need to minimize the efficiency gap. And that means the least number of votes are wasted as possible, which means that not too many people have their votes thrown out because they voted for a losing candidate, and not too many people vote for a winning candidate where all of this superfluous votes end up getting thrown out. And so what you end up with is somewhere in between having these districts that's like 51%, 49% winner, because 49% is a lot of votes to throw out. And it also gets away from a district that's like 99%, 1%, because 49% of voters voting on top of the number needed to win is also a waste. So it puts you somewhere in between, which ends up in practice better representing communities and reflecting the actual citizens in communities, the makeup of those communities, the interests of those communities, and you end up with less partisan candidates as well. Thanks for all this info, Illuminous, on ranked choice voting. Would love to dig into this more with you, especially please do join us in a couple of weeks when we get really involved there, and DM me if you want to discuss in more detail as well. Big business loves regulations. It crushes small business. I'm not sure if you can tell me what that how that connects to what we're talking about today, Richardson. Happy to address it. We definitely, I think it's a big issue, regulations and business, but I'm not sure how it relates here specifically. So back to the issue of gerrymandering and Let's talk a little bit more about the efficiency gap and what I mean by that. I gave you a brief explanation a couple of times, but it really is a complicated thing to wrap your head around. And that's why we need actually the help of computers to use the efficiency gap as a model to try to draw districts in a way that minimizes the efficiency gap throughout a map. And so basically what we're trying to do is eliminate having extreme candidates by not having 99% to 1, where you have a candidate that just the district is just too homogenous, or having a district that is and that's a sign generally of like having artificially packed a bunch of people into a district so that you win, meaning that actually the impact is that all these other districts have been splintered and they lose. On the flip side, exactly that you have you pack enough voters in to just win enough and drown out all these other voices. So computers can use the efficiency gap, the principle of wasted votes, to better draw district maps that correspond to distinct communities so that they can have distinct representation, which they deserve as part of a representative democracy. That is how we can end gerrymandering. It is easy to do. It is proven that it works. And it would be an easy principle for the courts to enforce because it is cut and dry quantitative math. And thank you all for the gifts you're sending on TikTok. I do appreciate it. It helps us promote these videos to get a little bit more viewership. So please do keep sending those our way. Also happy to field questions as we continue talking about this really important issue. How do we get these old geriatric reps and senators out and get a newer generation? I appreciate this, Devin. And it's something we discussed. Should there be an age limit on candidates who run for office? We have a minimum. Should we have a maximum? We're not going there. Maybe it's something worth discussing. But I do think that by virtue of this very proposal that we're talking about right now, right, ending election rigging, aka gerrymandering, the real election rigging, basically what we're doing is taking the power to determine how people get into power away from the people in power. Because if people in power have the power to determine how people get into power, they keep getting into power. And so you end up with someone like Chuck Grassley, who literally has been in power for, I think, 50 plus years, because how can you lose if you can stack the deck, if you can choose who your voters are? So I think that is right. That is ensuring that you have, as you said, geriatric reps. Nothing against that community, but I guess using that term is accurate, because what you end up with is career politicians that are in office for decades and decades, and it becomes not even a civil service anymore. It just becomes a career and a power grab and a power perpetuation. And that's how we get them out. I mean, ultimately, there's nothing wrong with someone old, geriatric, running for office. The problem is when they artificially keep themselves in office by rigging the system and rigging elections. Yes, Tiger Beat, lots of politicians are in the back pockets of special interests. That is a issue we tackled in our second constitutional conversation, our first reconstitutional proposal, separation of money and politics. I encourage you to look at our explainer video in our TikTok history on that. We also have on YouTube a lengthy discussion similar to this one on that topic from a few weeks back. Yes, I totally understand, Devin, what you were getting at. It's why I giggled a little bit. Yes, I think the issue is the longevity of representation, not the elderliness of representation. But I do appreciate that. And ultimately, even longevity is not a bad thing. You have representatives who have been really great representatives in office for a long time. They are rare, but they do exist. But those ones tend to emerge naturally, not by virtue of artificially stacking the deck, corrupting the process by virtue of drawing districts in their own favor. Tiger beat, yes, the NRA is one of the biggest special interests. Um, Agreed. And again, we've tackled special interests in lobbying and money in a different video. There needs to be term limits in all political offices. Very interesting. It's something we have discussed. We do believe that by virtue of a lot of these other proposals we have, um, we would probably solve a lot of the issues that we think we would solve by imposing term limits without the negative consequence of ending up kicking out of office people who were actually quite good. John Lewis comes to mind. He was in office for many, many years and a champion of civil rights. And I wouldn't want to lose people like that in office. It's a bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If we had to, I would. But I do think there are better ways to get to the end state we want than term limits in all political offices. Ultimately, if people choose to elect someone, I think that's okay as long as the system hasn't been corrupted or rigged to have that person continually get into power simply because they have the power to determine how they get into power. Would getting rid of lobbyists help or hurt us more? Great question. Again, we did discuss this a little bit in our separation of money and politics discussion. Lobbyists, we can't get rid of lobbyists completely. It's A, not possible, and B, it would be detrimental. The question is the amount, the magnitude of influence they have. They have too much influence because there's no regulation. Well, not no regulation, but there's not enough regulation. There's too many loopholes in it, and they have too much influence and power. I know this. I worked as a lobbyist or for lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Over a decade ago. For about 4 years until I left and eventually landed in working in education. Lobbyists provide an important need in the ecosystem, similarly to just like someone who is accused of murder and everyone knows they murdered someone, they still deserve an attorney, right? That's how the system works. We have countervailing forces, and the system works through that to find justice. In this case of lobbyists are useful in that they provide subject matter expertise from industries that can be quite complicated, and they also provide a counterbalance to each other. There are different special interests that are battling, and by battling against each other, they are balancing each other and providing a lot of information to the people writing policies. Now, again, the problem is that when they're paying all of these people, when they have too much influence, then suddenly they get to say what the policies are rather than inform policymakers in making the decisions and in writing the laws for themselves. But it's a great question, but we did cover it a bit a few weeks ago. That's a subject that will be an all-nighter. I'm not sure I remember what I was talking about when you typed that user 4204. But if you want to remind me, I'm happy to take it up. Stop gerrymandering. 100%. Stop drawing voter lines to benefit a specific party. Yes, Tiger, that is what we were talking about here. So 100% agree with you. Yes, thank you so much, Devin, for clarifying that. However, pharma lobbyists are the worst. Big pharma has a lot of problems. I agree, and it's been corrupted similarly to most industries. It's particularly problematic because it's people's health and lives and corrupting the field of medicine, which is founded on the Hippocratic principle of do no harm. So lots of problems there. The opioid crisis is an example of it. The banning of certain very helpful drugs that can't be patented is a problem. There's problems all over that. But again, we did discuss a lot about how to solve those issues in our very first proposal, separation of money and politics. I apologize. I'm losing my voice a little bit. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm still getting over COVID as we speak. So I'm doing my best to overcome the brain fog and overcome the gravelly voice. But I really do appreciate everyone joining me today. I'm happy to field any final questions. But again, gerrymandering is one of the most straightforward topics we have because there's universal agreements that it's anti-democratic, it's corrupt. And the question is how to end it. And people may not be familiar enough with it, but there's math to solve it that can be plugged into computers to easily, in this day and age, draw maps that optimize for distinct communities to have distinct representation. And that's all it comes down to. And we can take the power to determine how people get into power away from the people in power so that we don't have people continuously perpetuating their own power. It's simply common sense. So that's what we're proposing. Again, minimize the efficiency gap, compact and contiguous territories, put those things together, put it into a computer, and you have a better system. And of course, that can all be monitored and have oversight by the courts. There are ways to manage that. It would be redrawn every 10 years with the census, but it's a simple solution to a universally agreed upon problem of corruption and perpetuated power grabs that needs to end. So the only reason that we haven't done it is for that very reason, is that the people in power want to keep that power to continue to draw the districts in a way that keeps them in power. That's the only reason that we can't get something passed that has such universal agreement. So it's going to take the people coming together, demanding that that something like this happens, and it has to happen at the constitutional level, because otherwise there will be tons of workarounds and loopholes, and we just have to make this firm as a bedrock principle of our democracy, of our constitutional republic. So thank you all for joining me. I'll hold for another 10 seconds to see if any final questions come in. If not, we will end for today, and we will be back next week for actually an interesting side discussion on more of on political identity and political viewpoints and how we can become more open-minded in our politics. It's a little bit of a detour, but I think everyone will find it very interesting, and it comes with a really fun political test so that you can classify yourself. Devin, one last question. Would making the census every 4 years be better so our numbers are up to date as possible? I love that. The census is expensive to conduct because we need to make sure we do so accurately, because there's lots of ways that if we don't audit it properly, that people could probably game the system. So I think obviously it would be great to have a real-time census, right? But I think that may be, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure what the budgetary implications are, how much it actually costs. I do know, though, that it is a very big effort to do. And so, and it may not be as big of a deal because the composition of territories don't change that quickly. 10 years, that's a long time. 4 years, it would be nice, but it may not be necessary. Succession is the only way. I think you mean secession, and I'm not sure which party you're talking about, body without organs, but I think, for lack of a better pun, a union without states would not function so well. So anyway, on that note, I appreciate everyone's time. Really glad that we had such an active discussion. Join us back for next week. Look out for more videos, and grateful for you all. Continue the conversation. Thanks again. Bye now.